Mamedov. Он представляет американскую международную школу в Шанхае, North American International School. И доклад Structural Expansions through Motivic Essence, Tchaikovsky's Piano Concerto No. 1. Please, пожалуйста.
Секундочку. Сейчас. Видно, да? Okay. Okay. Good evening, everyone, from Shanghai. So this presentation covers pianistic repertoire, more specifically orchestral work by Tchaikovsky, his Piano Concerto No. 1 in B-flat minor. This is ultimately a monumental work that is one of the most prominent pieces for modern concert pianists, with most acclaimed recordings by Richter. We have Ashkenazy, Bronfman, Lugansky, and of course, many, many more. When it comes to Russian Romantic Concerti, we are more likely to find Rachmaninoff's and Tchaikovsky's works on the concert programs. And this is, of course, not the same when it comes to music analysis, since only a small portion of research focuses on these large-scale works, especially when investigating from perspective of music theory, which is precisely what made this project interesting to me. These large-scale works often have small details and nuances that are analytically influential in the context of an entire work. Specifically for Tchaikovsky Piano Concerto, the first movement is quite lengthy, often in the range of 15 minutes if played in appropriate tempo, and sometimes even longer. So looking at motivic segments, motifs in general, and how the composer uses these to expand his themes, we can trace many fascinating ideas that Tchaikovsky considered during his compositional process. Now, I realized that the Tchaikovsky's Piano Concerto underwent various revisions, and the piece became considerably easier to play as compared to the original publication, so his original writing. And for the sake of analysis, I will focus on the most recent edition, the one that is most commonly heard in the concert halls. Tchaikovsky's Piano Concerto was originally drafted by 1875, with the most recent version published in 1888. Now, this is not his only piano concerto, although this definitely is one of his most known works, especially for in pianistic circles. The first concerto consists of 3 movements, with much of what I will talk about will be happening in the opening movement of the concerto. The first movement is known for its extended length and the 2 piano cadenzas. While not overly difficult or technically challenging for pianists, these cadenzas do pose a series of interesting observations, especially based on the patterns that Tchaikovsky uses to create them. Another interesting remark is the main theme of the concerto, that is in the key of D-flat major rather than the B-flat minor. Interestingly enough, the first and the last movements also end in B-flat major and not B-flat minor. Pianistically speaking, the concerto is not the most comfortable to play, even though much of what covers some of the prominent elements of the work exists in the forms of scales, arpeggios, or a combination of the two, sometimes broken down or shortened. The motivic ascents that occur throughout the first movement, or in other words, these rising sequential patterns, also have these characteristics that can be simplified into basic fundamental musical ideas, which are ultimately placed together to create longer phrases. I want to look at a few examples of the first movement where the composer specifically chooses to utilize motivic ascents. This is done to expand his thematic ideas by employing a sequence of melodic rises to develop musical build-up, as well as to preserve this level of dramatic tension that continually seeks for a musical resolution. The musical ascents also produce a sequence of melodic climaxes throughout the movement, which Tchaikovsky does by integrating this tactical compositional balance between the primary thematic material and the accompaniment. In some instances, it bifurcates among the orchestra and the piano parts, while in others, we can only trace this in the soloist piano section, such as what we can see happening in the cadenza. The compositional construction that Tchaikovsky selects for the first movement outlines and codifies phrases and primary motivic segments, and the composer carefully plans this framework of the concerto by transforming and moving among multiple shorter segments, which allows him, of course, to choose to alter his short thematic motifs. Here we can see the piano reduction score of the concerto's opening, which is played by the orchestra, more specifically the horns. These four notes of F, D flat, C, and B flat are essentially the building blocks of much of the musical material throughout the movement. And in the opening three measures, these are seen 3 times, separated by a series of chords. Let's look at the portion of the music which occurs in the early stages of the movement, beginning at measure 41. That starts in the second line of the illustration. This is the first instance in the concerto of piano being used by Tchaikovsky as a solo instrument without any instrumental accompaniment. We had instances prior to this, especially in the opening phrase, where piano has a relatively short solo segment, but there was an accompanimental instrument to support the main thematic material played by the orchestra. In this particular example, the cadenza is made up of short subphrases, each of which consists of a thematic idea, which we originally see at the very beginning of the concerto. And this is ultimately the combination of these four notes. These 4 notes are followed with a motivic ascent, and in both left and right hands. In the first example, the motivic ascent uses the notes F, A flat, C flat, and D, which is a full diminished 7th chord, and the chord that finalizes the opening 4 notes of the right hand in the cadenza is also a full diminished 7th chord. Coincidentally, the chord that ends the imitation of the subphrase is identical to the motivic ascent. This is simply a case of Tchaikovsky sort of unraveling his chord before moving to the second portion of the cadenza. Quite an appealing procedure, in my opinion, since Tchaikovsky primarily employs 4 notes to create this entire passage. Following that, we have another series of 4 notes in the right hand, which are D, C natural, B flat, and A flat. The A flat is supported by an additional full diminished 7th chord, which contains notes D, F, A flat, and C flat. So exactly the same notes are used for this motivic ascent, except in a different order. It seems as a fairly straightforward way to start a solo section where the composer uses the thematic material from the initial theme to build and generate his melodies and phrases. Both portions of the phrase are ultimately related. More precisely, both of these belong to the same fully diminished 7th chord. I find it quite fascinating how Tchaikovsky is able to use simple ideas such as scales, arpeggiated runs, and partial motives to create this complex musical design. And this is one of those examples in his piano concerto where Tchaikovsky does this in his opening cadenza. We think of cadenzas as these virtuoso solo passages, which are often not found at the very start of the concerto, but this is obviously not the case here. So the cadenza appears right after the composer introduces the primary theme, the main theme. And of course, while I wouldn't call it pianistically easy or technically easy in terms of technique, it does simplify to the usage of fundamental seventh chords. The compositional strategy comes to an abrupt halt in measure 43. where Tchaikovsky uses a series of rising rolled chords still in piano solo. Once these resolve, Tchaikovsky restarts his previously established motivic ascents in a similar fashion as seen in the previous illustration. Therefore, the opening two segments are reinstated 3 more times. The difference here, however, is that Tchaikovsky changes his choice of the full diminished 7th chord, and this time includes notes G, B flat, D flat, and F flat. So overall, we have 5 measures and an excessive use of chords and arpeggiated runs that define fully diminished harmonies. Another interesting detail is the exact amount of tuplets that each run contains. For the most part, Tchaikovsky uses 14 notes in between the start and the end of each melodic ascent. And the sole difference is the 16 tuplet notes that exist in between the first of the 3 ascents that we can see in measure 44. While this seems rather straightforward from an analytical perspective, the examination of the pianistic interpretation would be a lot different. Especially with no orchestral support, the pianist has a full control over how, specifically how these motivic ascents are played. Tchaikovsky also seems to allow for this interpretational deviation in a sense, by not providing any specific directions in terms of tempo. So the score has a mark to slow down at the octave section right before the melodic ascents begin. But aside from reminding the pianist to return back to original tempo, there are no further musical directions. Let's look at the 4 note patterns found in that solo passage starting around measure 41. We can do this by completely ignoring the groups of the 64th tuplets. Now, the interesting observation here is the difference between analytical and performative points of view. In terms of motivic development, the 4 note patterns are the concerto's primary thematic material and are emphasized by Tchaikovsky with the use of accents on each of the 4 notes. On the contrary, from the perspective of pianism and the pianistic technique, the shape and lyricism are, of course, defined through these rapid and ascending passages. But there are a few interesting remarks that can be made if we are to remove the secondary thematic material of the solo section. We have a total of 3, which include the range of a tritone if we are to calculate the intervals between the first and the 4 notes in each group. In between them, we have an interesting circulation of intervallic gaps. So in the first example, we have 3 semitones between C flat and A flat, 2 semitones between A flat and G flat, and 1 semitone between G flat and F. So if we look at the intervallic gaps between the separate tones of each group, they all differ, offering some sort of combinations with 3, 2, or 1 semitones. What's more interesting is that if we are to focus only on the first note of each of this group, so only on the initial note of the 4, in this case, we have a C flat, which is an harmonic equivalent to B, followed by D from the second group and F from the third group, which produces an harmonically equivalent diminished triad. If we are to look at the second portion of the solo section, similar scenario exists with a total of 3 groups, each of which also has 4 notes. And Tchaikovsky continues to expand the cadenza through these transformations, specifically transforming the opening notes of each motive, all while initializing a new set of segments in the second phrase. This time, the composer uses 4 notes motifs that start from D flat, F flat, and G. And as the case with the previous 4 note patterns, the opening notes of each group outline a diminished triad. Similar to the analysis of integrating the 4 note motifs with the melodic ascents that precede these motifs, we are back to working with diminished harmonies. And this is a recurring ideology all the way throughout the solo piano section. What I find even more fascinating is the fact that Tchaikovsky neglects to resolve any of these diminished triads or fully diminished 7th chords. So each time there is an opportunity for resolution, the composer provides more dissonance, more tension. And this goes all the way until measure 61, where we enter the variation of the opening, the initial theme, with a final resolution in the key of D flat major. Let's move on towards the middle section of the first movement and specifically focus on the portion of the music starting in measure 244. This is the transitionary material before piano has the famous octave section. The main melody is played by orchestra, and the pianist is basically supports the orchestra through a cascade of arpeggiations. This section contains 4 beats in each measure, with each beat represented in a sequence of triplets. At the rehearsal G mark, at the very start of measure 244, Tchaikovsky uses a combination of C minor arpeggios and chords to descend over the course of the entire bar. However, the descent is overshadowed by a contrasting Motivic ascent. So on measure 245, the same compositional idea can be applied, only this time instead of G being the highest note in the context of C minor harmony, Tchaikovsky moves up to A flat with A flat major harmony. And this trend continues one more time in measure 246, which generates an A dominant 7th harmony by using notes A, C sharp, E, and G. So we have 3 measures, each with a separate harmony, each with a series of downward plunging arpeggios and chords, but all 3 measures undergo Motivic ascent, which is realized by sol semitone. Also, something noteworthy to look at is the lowest note of each measure that stays static at G in the left hand and occurs on every 4th beat of each bar. So after these 3 measures, Tchaikovsky is not done using this particular compositional method. And instead of using 1 harmony for each measure, he switches to 2 harmonies per measure, with 1 harmony for beats 1 and 2, and another harmony for beats 3 and 4. We can see that in measures 247 through 250. 3 measures span for a total of 6 harmonies, while the last measure has 4 harmonies for the 4 beats. All of this prolongs tension without any sense of resolution, and Tchaikovsky nears the passage that involves the pianist playing a continuous string of parallel octaves, which can be thought of as a climax section of this larger section of the concerto. The parallel octave section also creates a sudden change in purpose of the piano in the concerto. So for the transition, which we just went through, the transition that precedes the octave section, the piano serves as accompaniment. Here, however, in the octaves, the pianist is a soloist who is accompanied by the orchestra. These last 4 measures also lose out on the static bass note, which measures 244 through 246 had as a pitch G. Another instance of this technique is seen towards the end of the movement when the theme is reinstated, although varied and in a different key. So in this instance, rather than having 3 measures of 1 harmony per measure, Tchaikovsky uses 4 measures for a total of 4 harmonies, where each measure ultimately ascends. Another difference to consider is that this is not a chromatic ascent, since the first 2 measures are separated by a whole tone and not a half tone. We can also see that after the 4 measures, Tchaikovsky only prolongs the phrase by 2 measures, where each measure has 2 harmonies. In this instance, the 2nd and 3rd measures of the 2nd line have a B flat major, B major, C major, and D flat major. The phrase ends with Tchaikovsky including a separate harmony for each beat in the next 2 measures, which equals to 8 more sequential harmonies to end in the key of G flat major. Tchaikovsky is often hesitant to provide closure on his phrases, and these small extensions that span through prolonged transitions show that. But in cases such as this one, Tchaikovsky rejects the much anticipated B flat major harmony at the very end, and instead chooses to introduce another key. Coincidentally, the G flat major is also the start of the next section, which is another piano solo part. The first piano concerto is an interesting composition, worth studying from an analytical perspective, to see how Tchaikovsky interprets his melodies and essentially to understand musically what was his final goal. When it comes to using and borrowing own thematic material, the composer doesn't shy away from extending motifs into larger phrases and connecting these to build up musical tension, while seeking for these dramatic resolutions. In some instances, the listener gets to hear it, while in others, ultimately not. But the overuse of seventh harmonies and the outlines of these diminished triads, as seen in the soloist sections of the work, continually develop out of the initial four opening note in the movement. And this is an instance of using a four-note motif upon which Tchaikovsky builds an entire movement. Additionally, the use of melodic ascents by integrating these motifs in a sequential pattern, this generates time through which the music gains energy before Tchaikovsky finds a way to revolve into another theme. And thank you very much. Now, before I also want to, I wasn't able to show examples, ultimately the audio examples, so I'm going to show it right now. I'm going to share the screen one more time. And I'm going to show where let me see, 120. Yeah, so this is the cadenza, that solo passage that initializes the cadenza. One moment. Oops. Not this. Yep, here we go. And so on. So, okay, that's it. Thank you very much. Yeah.
Спасибо огромное. Есть ли вопросы? Хорошо, Мария, потом тогда я.
English, Russian.
Either way.
Which one's best? No, it doesn't matter.
English is better actually, but
okay.
I
wanted to know your opinion of how do you encourage performers to actually pay attention to what you can find in the theoretical ideas through the motifs? Because personally, I find this concerto problematic in that performers have turned it into something that is completely not what the manuscript or even the published score might suggest. And I thought it was so refreshing that somebody's actually taking the motifs really seriously, and whether that has any scope for trying to resolve all the structural issues that keep getting, very problematic in this concerto.
Yeah, so yeah, that's actually one of the, as you said, as you just stated, the playing it is already difficult enough. There's enough troubles that a pianist has to go through to learn it, obviously. But I don't think an analytical perspective. I don't think analytical perspective must be included ultimately for a performer, but it is something to look at. So it is something that the performer may find of interest, I think. So again, There are different interpretations, right? So everyone has their own interpretation how to play it. But and I think if somebody wants to put emphasis on these motifs, then they can. But if they don't, we have a lot of performances where people obviously don't put much interest in this. So
I almost feel like the people actually doing the proper analysis of these motifs are a little bit humble in saying that, oh, you can do it if you want to, and if you don't want to, it doesn't matter. Just purely because everybody's saying, oh, it's a really hard concerto. And so the excuse is it's hard, so the performer does what they kind of want. But for example, when you were talking about the opening motif, and there's a kind of a set tempo that it might like to go at, depending on whether it's performance tempo or not. But how much would you use a motif as an indication of tempo throughout the whole work? Because I'm struck by the last movement always. And the idea that the recurring is every time. And if you unify those two tempi, you firstly get a more playable opening, which means it wouldn't have a huge that makes sense into the development. But then crucially, the last movement is playable. If it's then you don't have to break your fingers doing it. And I'm just wondering whether we're all a bit guilty as academics. I mean, I'm a more performer than an academic, so I go more by instinct. But it sort of feels like we're always apologizing that we come up with all these motifs and then we kind of just leave it there. But how do we cross that?
And actually use it, yeah. It's interesting because, I mean, for this particular piece, it has such a rich performance tradition. When you look at different, in terms of tempo, you have people who played really fast, like Boris Berezovsky, and then you have other ones that played, well, I wouldn't say slow, but slower, like Evgeny Kissin. I think he was 15 or 16 when he played with Karajan. And I mean, example.
I'm wondering whether that's Karajan just saying it's a slow day today because.
But when you look at Berezovsky playing, I forgot the name of the guy. I think it was one of the French conductors, but they started slow, and then Berezovsky just went 1.5 times the tempo for his chords, and then they all picked up the tempo after that. So yeah, I mean, the performance tradition is so rich for this. I don't think I have an answer of like what's the right way to do it. I think
I don't think that there necessarily will be a right way, but do you think in just generally in Tchaikovsky's output, motivic development needs to be seen more as a architectural tool, perhaps, rather than just a curiosity?
I mean, when we look at all the motifs he put in there, obviously he thinks it's important, right? I mean, these 4 notes are all over the concerto, so he did find it important. But but in terms of pianistic interpretations, everyone has their own thoughts and ideas of how to play. And like you said before, for many people, it's just it doesn't even get to how fast, because for many people it's just like let's learn it first, and then and then we can see if we can speed up the tempo and care about the motives. So
Thank you.
Еще вопросы? Тогда можно я спрошу, можно, да, по-русски?
Да.
Спасибо большое за очень интересный доклад, очень интересный анализ, но у меня следующий вопрос. При анализе вы использовали текст так называемой 3-й редакции, который Чайковский не делал. Она имеет значительные расхождения с авторским текстом, в том числе и структурно, как мы знаем, что в финале была сделана огромная купюра. Вот, поэтому вот мой вопрос, это ваша позиция или как бы просто вы не брали этого внимания вообще, ваше отношение к этому? Потому что сейчас на самом деле у первого концерта 2 авторские редакции, первая, которая играла Бю, второй, собственно говоря, с которым Чайковский, можно сказать, весь мир объехал. Вот. 3-я редакция появилась, судя по всему, сразу после его смерти, скорее всего, к ней имел отношение Александр Визиотти. Вот, это как бы все уже доказано. И в 2015 году обе авторские редакции вышли в составе академического полного собрания сочинений Чайковского. До этого как бы текст такой авторской редакции пробовал восстановить в старом собрании сочинений Александр Борисович Гальденвейзер, да, просто ему тогда не были доступны все те источники, которые обнаружены были сейчас. Но, тем не менее, это структурно внутри, да, все равно это все-таки немножко другое. Вот, и мне хотелось бы ваш комментарий на этот счет.
Ну да, насколько я понимаю, вот этот, который на русском не очень хорошо, но вот этот текст, да, вот эти ноты, которые я использовал, это как самые более использованные на концертах, это самый последний вариант, насколько я понимаю. Ну, был первый, который еще Рубинштейн критиковал, да, то есть там, который был очень сложно было играть, поэтому.
Да, дело в том, ну вот, видимо, просто вам ну, как-то у вас не было возможности познакомиться со всей последней литературой касаемо первого фортепианного концерта. Да, к сожалению, более чем 100 лет фортепианного исполнительства настолько внедрили вот тот текст, который вы показывали. Но для начала, что первые аккорды фортепиано, они вообще в другом расположении, и они арпеджиаты у Чайковского, и были до конца жизни. И это играл и Ганс фон Бюлов, и Сергей Иванович Танеев. И, кстати говоря, Рубинштейн, в том числе на Всемирной выставке в Париже, играли все знаменитые пианисты. И когда появилась вот та редакция, которую мы сейчас знаем да, мы все ее знаем хорошо, и вот сейчас вы фрагмент включили, Сергей Иванович Танеев написал просто письмо, есть знаменитое письмо Танеева к Игумнову, что вообще, что он слушает концерты, вообще его не узнает. И вот сейчас, когда восстановлен этот текст, и первой, и второй редакции, как бы, потому что сейчас, ну, как бы считается все-таки, вы не можете себе представить исследователей творчества Баха, да, или пианисты, которые анализируют или играют Баха по Муджелине. Или, да, вот, и все-таки было бы интересно вот послушать ваши наблюдения, когда вы увидите тот текст, который действительно написал Чайковский. Вот. Желаю вам удачи, очень интересно, спасибо огромное за доклад. Еще вопросы будут? Так, мы еще раз благодарим нашего докладчика. И последний доклад на сегодня, я думаю, мы не будем делать перерыв. Это мой доклад, который называется «Мы ходили с Алешей во дворец Дожи о неизвестном факте биографии Чайковского». Сейчас, одну секундочку, я включу демонстрацию экрана. Видно? Видно? Сейчас.
Да, видно.
Да, сейчас, извиняюсь.